Book the second, chapter the 11th, contains some introductory particulars relative to a young gentleman who now arrives upon the scene and a new adventure which happened to Oliver. It was almost too much happiness to bear. Oliver felt stunned and stupefied by the unexpected intelligence. He could not weep or speak or rest. He had scarcely the power of understanding anything that had passed, until after a long ramble in the quiet evening air, a burst of tears came to his relief, and he seemed to awaken all at once to a full sense of the joyful change that had occurred, and the almost insupportable load of anguish which had been taken from his breast. The night was fast closing when he returned homewards, laden with flowers which he had culled with peculiar care, the adornment of the sick chamber. As he walked briskly along the road, he heard behind him the noise of some vehicle approaching at a furious pace. Looking round, he saw that it was a post-chaise driven at great speed, and as the horses were galloping and the road was narrow, he stood leaning against a gate until it should have passed him by. As it dashed on, Oliver caught a glimpse of a man in a white nightcap, whose face seemed familiar to him, although his view was so brief that he could not identify the person. In another second or two, the nightcap was thrust out of the chaise window, and a stentorian voice bellowed to the driver to stop, which he did as soon as he could pull up his horses, when the nightcap once again appeared, and the same voice called Oliver by his name. "Stop thief, stop thief." "Here!" cried the voice. "Master Oliver, what's the news? Miss Rose, Master Oliver!" "Is it you, Giles?" cried Oliver, running up to the chaise door. Giles popped out his nightcap again, preparatory to making some reply, when he was suddenly pulled back by a young gentleman who occupied the other corner of the chaise, who eagerly demanded what was the news. "In a word," cried the gentleman, "better or worse?" "Better, much better," replied Oliver hastily. "Thank heaven!" exclaimed the gentleman. "You are sure?" "Quite sure." "Quite, sir," replied Oliver. "The change took place only a few hours ago, and Mr. Losberne says that all danger is at an end." The gentleman said not another word, but opening the chaise door, leaped out, and taking Oliver hurriedly by the arm, led him aside. "This is quite certain? There's no possibility of any mistake on your part, my boy, is there?" demanded the gentleman in a tremulous voice. "Pray, do not deceive me by awakening any hopes that are not to be filled." "I would not for the world, sir," replied Oliver. "Indeed, you may believe me, Mr. Losberne's words were that she would live to bless us all for many years to come. I heard him say so." The tears stood in Oliver's eyes as he recalled the scene which was the beginning of so much happiness. The gentleman turned his face away and remained silent for some minutes. Oliver thought he heard him sob more than once, but he feared to interrupt him by any farther remark, for he could well guess what his feelings were, and so stood apart, feigning to be occupied with his nosegay. All this time, Mr. Giles, with the white nightcap on, had been sitting upon the steps of the chaise, supporting an elbow on each knee and wiping his eyes with a blue cotton pocket handkerchief, dotted with white spots. That the honest fellow had not been feigning emotion was abundantly demonstrated by the very red eyes with which he regarded the young gentleman when he turned round and addressed him. "I think you'd better go on to my mother's in the chaise, Giles," said he. "I'd rather walk slowly on so as to gain a little time before I see her. You can say I'm coming." "I beg your pardon, Mr. Harry," said Giles, giving a final polish to his ruffled countenance with the handkerchief. "But if you would leave the postboy to say that, I should be very much obliged to you. It wouldn't be proper for the maids to see me in this state, sir. I should never have any more authority with them if I did." "If they did." "Well," rejoined Harry Maylie, smiling, "you can do as you like." We're joined by Harry Maylie, smiling. "You can do as you like. Let him go on with the portmanteaus if you wish it. Do you follow with us? Only first exchange the nightcap for some more appropriate covering, or we'll be taken for madmen." Mr. Giles, reminded of his unbecoming costume, snatched off and pocketed his nightcap, and substituted a hat of grave and sober shape which he took out of the chaise. This done, the postboy drove off, and Giles, Mr. Maylie, and Oliver followed at their leisure. As they walked along, Oliver glanced from time to time with much interest and curiosity at this newcomer. The newcomer. He seemed about 25 years of age, and was of the middle height. His countenance was frank and handsome, and his demeanor singularly easy and prepossessing. Notwithstanding the differences between youth and age, he bore so strong a likeness to the old lady that Oliver would have had no great difficulty in imagining their relationship, even if he had not already spoken of her as his mother. Mrs. Maylie was anxiously waiting to receive her son when he reached the cottage, and the meeting did not take place without great emotion on both sides. "Oh, mother," whispered the young man, "why did you not write before?" "I did write," replied Mrs. Maylie, "but on reflection I determined to keep back the letter until I had heard Mr. Losburne's opinion." "But why?" said the young man. "Why run the chance of that occurring which so nearly happened? If Rose had— I cannot utter that word now. If this illness had terminated differently, how would you ever have forgiven yourself, or I been happy again?" "If that had been the case, Harry," said Mrs. Maylie, "I fear your happiness would have been effectually blighted, and that your arrival here a day sooner or a day later would have been of very, very little import." "And who can wonder if it be so, mother?" rejoined the young man. "Or why should I say if? It is, you know it, mother, you must know it. I know that she well deserves the best and purest love that the heart of man can offer," said Mrs. Maylie. "I know that the devotion and affection of her nature require no ordinary return, but one that shall be deep and lasting. If I did not feel this, and know, besides, that a changed behavior in one she loved would break her heart, I should not feel my task so difficult of performance, or have to encounter so many struggles in my bosom, when I take what seems to me to be the strict line of duty." "This is unkind, mother," said Harry. "Do you still suppose that I am so much a boy as to not know my own mind, or to mistake the impulses of my own soul?" "I think, my dear fellow," returned Mrs. Maylie, laying her hand upon his shoulder, "I think, my dear fellow, that youth has— many generous impulses which do not last, and that among them are some which, being gratified, become only the more fleeting. Above all, I think," said the lady, fixing her eyes on her son's face, "that if an enthusiastic, ardent, ambitious young man has a wife on whose name is a stain, which, though it originate in no fault of hers, may be visited by cold and sordid people upon her and upon his children also, and in exact proportion to his success in the world, be cast in his teeth and made the subject of sneers against him, he may, no matter how generous and good his nature, one day repent of the connection he formed in early life, and she may have the pain and torture of knowing that he does so." "Mother," said the young man impatiently, "he would be a mere brute, selfish brute, unworthy alike of the name of man and of the woman you describe, who acted thus." "You think so now, Harry?" replied his mother. "And ever will," said the young man. "The mental agony I have suffered during the last 2 days wrings from me the undisguised avowal to you of passion which, as you well know, is not one of yesterday, but one I had lightly formed. On Rose, sweet young girl, my heart is set as firmly as ever heart of man is set on woman. I have no thought or view or hope in life beyond her, and if you oppose me in this great state, you take my peace and happiness in your hands, and cast them to the wind. Mother would think better of this, and of which I said that wrong. Mother, think better of this, and of me, and do not disregard the warm feelings of which you seem to think so little. Edward Leford." Harry, said Mrs. Maylie, "it is because I think so much of warm and sensitive hearts that I would spare them from being wounded. But we have said enough, and more than enough, on this matter just now." "Let it rest with Rose, then," interposed Harry. "You will not press these overstrained opinions of yours so far as to throw any obstacle in my way?" "I will not," rejoined Mrs. Maylie, "but I would have you consider—" "I have considered for years," was the impatient reply. "I have considered for years, considered almost since I have been capable of serious reflection. My feelings remain unchanged as they ever will. And why Why should I suffer the pain of a delay in giving them vent which can be productive of no earthly good? No. Before I leave this place, Rose shall hear me. She shall, said Mrs. Maylie. There's something in your manner which would almost imply that she will hear me coldly, mother, said the young man anxiously. Not coldly, rejoined the young lady. Not coldly, rejoined the old lady. Far from it. How then? Urged the young man. She has formed no other attachment. No, indeed, replied his mother. You have, or I mistake, too strong a hold on her affections already. What I would say, resumed the old lady, stopping her son as he was about to speak, is this. Before you stake your all on this chance, before you suffer yourself to be carried to the highest point of hope, reflect for a few moments. The here and now, my dear child, on Rose's history. Consider what effect the knowledge of her doubtful birth may have on her decision, devoted as she is to us with all the intensity of her noble mind, and that perfect sacrifice of self, which in all matters, great or trifling, has always been her characteristic. What do you mean? That I leave to you to discover, replied Mrs. Maylie. I must go back to Rose. God bless you. I shall see you again tonight, said the young man eagerly. By and by, replied the lady, when I leave Rose. You will tell her I'm here, said Harry. Of course, replied Mrs. Maylie, and say how anxious I've been, and how much I have suffered, how I long to see her. You will not refuse to do this, mother. No, said the old lady, I will tell her that. Pressing her son's hand affectionately, she hastened. Hashish, Hades. I hate when he does that. She hastened from the room. Mr. Losberne and Oliver had remained at another end of the apartment while this hurried conversation was proceeding. The former now held out his hand to Harry Maylie, and hearty salutations were exchanged between them. The doctor then communicated, in reply to the multifarious questions from his young friend, a precise account of his patient's situation, which was quite as consolatory and full of promise as Oliver's statement had encouraged him to hope. To the whole of which Mr. Giles, who affected to be busy about the luggage, listened with greedy ears. Have you shot anything particular lately, Giles? Inquired the doctor when he had concluded. Nothing particular, sir, replied Mr. Giles, coloring up to the eyes. Nor catching any thieves, nor identifying any housebreakers, said the doctor maliciously. Not at all, sir, replied Mr. Giles with much gravity. Well, said the doctor, I'm sorry to hear it, because you do that sort of thing so well. Pray, how is Brittles? The boy is very well, sir, said Mr. Giles, recovering his usual tone of patronage, and sends his respectful duty, sir. That's well, said the doctor. Seeing you here reminds me, Mr. Giles, that on the day before that on which I was called away so hurriedly, I executed, at the request of your good mistress, a small commission in your favor. Just step into this corner a moment, will you? Mr. Giles walked into the corner with much importance and some wonder, and was honored with a short whispering conference with the doctor, on the termination of which he made a great many bows, and retired with steps of unusual stateliness. The subject matter of this conference was not disclosed in the parlor, but the kitchen was speedily enlightened concerning it, for Mr. Giles walked straight thither, and having called for a mug of ale, announced with an air of majestic mystery, which was highly effective, that it had pleased his mistress, in consideration of his gallant behavior on the occasion of that attempted robbery, to deposit in the local savings bank the sum of £25 for his sole use and benefit. At this the two women servants lifted up their hands and eyes, and supposed that Mr. Giles would begin to be quite proud now. Whereunto Mr. Giles, pulling out his shirt frill, replied, No, and that if they observed at any time that he was at all haughty to his inferiors, he would thank them to tell him so, and Then he made a great many other remarks, no less illustrative of his humility, which were received with equal favor and applause, and were withal as original and as much to the purpose. And as much to the purpose as the remarks of great men commonly are. Above stairs, the remainder of the evening passed cheerfully away, for the doctor was in high spirits, and however fatigued or thoughtful Harry Maylie might have been at first, he was not proof against the worthy gentleman's good humour, which displayed itself in a great variety of sallies and professional recollections, and an abundance of small jokes, which struck Oliver as being the drollest things he had ever heard, and caused him to laugh proportionately, to the evident satisfaction of the doctor, who laughed immoderately at himself, and made Harry laugh almost as heartily by the very force of sympathy. So they were as pleasant a party as, under the circumstances, they could well have been, and it was late before they retired, with light and thankful hearts, to take that rest of which, after the doubt and suspense they had recently undergone, they stood so much in need. Oliver rose next morning in better heart, and went about his usual early occupations with more hope, pleasure, than he had known for many days. The birds were once more hung out to sing in their old places, and the sweetest wild flowers that could be found were once more gathered to gladden Rose with their beauty and fragrance. The melancholy which had seemed to the sad eyes of the anxious boy to hang for days past over every object, beautiful as they all were, was dispelled as though by magic. The dew seemed to sparkle more brightly on the green leaves, the air to rustle among them with a sweeter music, and the sky itself to look more blue and bright. Such is the influence which the condition of our own thoughts exercises even over the appearances of external objects. Men who look on nature and their fellow men, and cry that all is dark and gloomy, are in the right, but then the somber colors are reflections from their own jaundiced eyes and hearts. The real hues are delicate and require a clearer vision. It's worthy of remark, and Oliver did not fail to note at the time, that his morning expeditions were no longer made alone. Harry Maylie, after the very first morning when he met Oliver coming laden home, was seized with such a passion for flowers, and displayed such a taste in their arrangement, as left his young companion far behind. If Oliver were behindhand in these respects, however, he knew where the best were to be found, and morning after morning they scoured the country together, and brought home their fairest that blossomed. The window of the young lady's chamber was opened now, and she loved to feel the rich summer air stream in and revive her with its freshness. But there always stood in water just inside the lattice one particular little bunch which was made up with great care every morning. Oliver could not help noticing that the withered flowers were never thrown away, although the little vase was regularly replenished. Nor could he help observing that whenever the doctor came into the garden, he invariably cast his eyes up to that particular corner, and nodded his head most expressively as he set forth on his morning walks. Morning's walk. Pending these observations, the days were flying by. Rose was rapidly and surely recovering. Nor did Oliver's time hang heavy upon his hands, although the young lady had not yet left her chamber, lost overboard, and there were no evening walks, save now and then for a short distance with Mrs. Maylie. He applied himself with redoubled assiduity to the instructions of the white-headed old gentleman, and labored so hard that his quick progress surprised even himself. It was while he was engaged in this pursuit that he was greatly startled and distressed by a most unexpected occurrence. The little room. The little room in which he was accustomed to sit when busy at his books was on the ground floor at the back of the house. It was quite a cottage room, the latest window, around which were clusters of jessamine and honeysuckle, that crept over the casement and filled the place with their delicious perfume. It looked into a garden, whence a wicket gate opened into a small paddock. All beyond was fine meadowland and wood. There was no other dwelling near, in that direction, and that prospect it commanded was very extensive. One beautiful evening, when the first shades of twilight were beginning to settle upon the earth, Oliver sat at this window, intent upon his books. He had been poring over them for some time, and as the day had been uncommonly sultry, and he had exerted himself a great deal, it is no disparagement to the authors, whoever they may have been, to say that gradually and by slow degrees, he fell asleep. There's a kind of sleep that steals upon us sometimes, which, while it holds the body prisoner, does not free the mind from a sense of things about it, and enable it to ramble as it pleases, so far as an overpowering heaviness, a prostration of strength, and an utter inability to control our thoughts or power of emotion can't be called sleep. This is it. And yet we have a consciousness of all that is going on about us, and even if we dream, words which are really spoken, or sounds which really exist at the moment, accommodate themselves with surprising readiness to our visions, until reality and imagination become so strangely blended that it is afterwards almost a matter of authored impossibility to separate the authored two. Nor is this the most striking authored phenomenon incidental to such a state. It is an authored, authored fact ascertained that although our ascertained senses of touch and sight be for the time dead, yet our sleeping thoughts and the visionary scenes that dinner will be delicious pass before us will be influenced and materially influenced by the mere silent presence. Some external object which may not have been near us when we closed our eyes, and of whose vicinity we have had no waking consciousness. Oliver knew perfectly well that he was in his own little room, that his books were lying on the table before him, and that the sweet air was stirring among the creeping plants outside, and yet he was asleep. Suddenly the scene changed. The air became close and confined, and he thought with a glow of terror that he was in Mr. Fagin's house again. There sat the hideous old man in his accustomed corner, pointing at him, and whispering to another man with his face averted, who sat beside him. "Hush, my dear," he thought he heard Mr. Fagin say. "It is him, sure enough. Come away." He, the other man, seemed to answer. "Could I mistake him, think you? If a crowd of devils were to put themselves into this, his exact shape, he stood amongst them, there's something that would tell me how to point him out. If you buried him 50 feet deep and took me across his grave, I should know, if there wasn't a mark above it, that he lay buried there. Whither his flesh should." The man seemed to say this with such dreadful hatred that Oliver awoke with a fear and started up. Good God, what was that which sent the blood tingling to his heart and deprived him of voice or power to move? There, at the window, close before him, so close that he could have almost touched him before he started back. With his eyes peering into the room and meeting his, there stood the angel, and beside him, white with rage or fear or both, were the scowling features of the very man who had accosted him at the inn-yard. It was about an instant, a glance, a flash, before his eyes, and they were gone. But they had recognized him, and he them. Their look was as firmly impressed upon his memory as if it had been deeply carved in stone and set before him from his birth. He stood transfixed for a moment, and then, leaping from the window into the garden, called loudly for help. Book the 3rd, Chapter the 9th. Fatal Consequences. It was nearly 2 hours before daybreak, the time which in the autumn of the year may be truly called the dead of night, when the streets are silent and deserted, when even sound appears to slumber, and profligacy and riot have staggered home to dream. It was at this still and silent hour that Mr. Fagin sat watching in his old lair, with face so distorted and pale, and eyes so red and bloodshot, that he looked less like a man than some hideous phantom, moist from the grave, worried about an evil spirit. He sat crouching over a cold hearth, wrapped in an old torn coverlet, with his face turned towards a wasting candle that stood upon a table by his side. His right hand was raised to his lips, and as, absorbed in thought, he bit his long black nails. He disclosed among his toothless gums a few such fangs as he should have been a dog's or rat's. Stretched on a mattress upon the floor lay Noah Claypool, fast asleep. Towards him the old man sometimes directed his eyes for an instant, then brought them back again to the candle, which with long burnt wicks drooping almost double, and hot grease falling down in clots upon the table, plainly showed that his thoughts were busy elsewhere. Indeed they were mortification at the overthrow of his notable scheme, hatred of the girl who had dared to palter with strangers, and utter distrust of the sincerity of her refusal to yield him up, bitter disappointment at the loss of his revenge on Sykes, the fear of detection and ruin and death, and a fierce and deadly rage kindled by all. These were the passionate considerations which, following close upon each other with rapid and ceaseless whirl, shot through the brain of Fagin, shot through the brain of Cupid, as every evil thought and blackest purpose lay working at his heart. As every evil thought and blackest purpose lay working at his heart. Shot through the brain of Cupid, as every evil thought and blackest purpose lay working at his heart. He sat without changing his attitude in the least, or appearing to take the smallest heed of time, until his quick ear seemed to be attracted by a footstep in the street. "At last," muttered Mr. Fagin, wiping his dry and fevered mouth. "At last." The bell rang gently as he spoke. He crept upstairs to the door and presently returned, accompanied by a man muffled to the chin, who carried a bundle under one arm. Sitting down and throwing back his outer coat, the man displayed the burly frame of Sykes. "There," he said, laying the bundle on the table. "Take care of that and do the most you can with it. It's been trouble enough to get. I thought I should have been here 3 hours ago." Fagin laid his hand upon the bundle and, locking it in the cupboard, sat down again without speaking. But he did not take his eyes off the robber for an instant during this action. "Thank you." And now that they sat over against each other, face to face, he looked fixedly at him, with his lips quivering so violently and his face so altered by the emotions which had mastered him, that the housebreaker, involuntarily housebroke, drew back his chair and surveyed him with a look of real affright. "What now?" cried Sykes. "What do you look at me?" "At a man so for? Speak, will you?" Mr. Fagin raised his right hand and shook his trembling forefinger in the air, but his passion was so great that the power of speech was for the moment gone. "Damn me," said Sykes, feeling in his breast with a look of alarm. "He's gone mad. I must look to myself here." No, rejoined Fagin, finding his voice. It's You're not the person, Bill. I've no fault to find with you. Oh, you haven't, have you? Said Sykes, looking sternly at him, and ostentatiously passing the pistol into a more convenient pocket. That's lucky for one of us. Which one that is don't matter. I've got that to tell you, Bill, said Mr. Fagin, drawing his chair nearer. Will make you worse than me. Eh? Returned the robber with an incredulous air. Tell away, look sharp, or Nance will think I'm lost. Lost, cried Fagin. She has pretty well settled that. Well settled that in her own mind already. Sykes looked with an aspect of great perplexity into the angel's face, and reading no satisfactory explanation of the Bible there, the riddle there, clenched his coat collar in his huge hand and shook him soundly. Quit being cool. Speak, will you? He said, or if you don't, it shall be for want of breath. Open your mouth and say what you've got to say in plain words. Out with it, you thundering old cur, out with it. Suppose that lad that's lying there, Fagin began. Sykes turned round to where Noah was sleeping, as if he had not previously observed him. Well, he said, resuming his former position. Suppose that lad, pursued Mr. Fagin, was to peach. Blow upon us all. First seeking out the right folks for the purpose, then having a meeting with them in the street to paint our likenesses, describe every mark that they might know us by, the crib where we might be most easily taken. Suppose he was to do all this, and besides, to blow upon a plant we've all been in, more or less, of his own fancy, not grabbed, trapped, tried, earwigged by the parson, brought to it on bread and water, but of his own fancy, to please his own taste, stealing out at nights to find those most interested against us, peaching to them. Do you hear me? Cried Mr. Fagin, his eyes flashing with rage. Suppose he did all this, what then? What then? Replied Sykes with a tremendous oath. If he was left alive till I came, I'd grind his skull under the iron heel of my boot, with as many grains as there are hairs upon his head. What if I did it? Cried Mr. Fagin, almost in a yell. I, that know so much and could hang so many beside myself? I don't know, replied Sykes, clenching his teeth and turning white at the mere suggestion. I'd do something in the jail that'd keep me put in irons. If I was tried along with you, I'd fall upon you with them in the open court. I'll beat your brains out before the people. I should have such strength, muttered the robber, poising his brawny arm. So much strength that I could smash your head as if a loaded wagon had gone over it. You would? Would I? Said the housebreaker. Try me. If it was Charlie, or the Dodger, or Bet, or I don't care who, replied Sykes impatiently. Whoever it was, I'd serve them the same. Fagin again looked hard at the robber, and motioning him to be silent, stooped over the bed upon the floor, and shook the sleeper to rouse him. Sykes leant forward in his chair, looking on with his hands upon his knees, as if wondering much what all this questioning and preparation was to end in. Bolter! Bolter! Poor lad, said Fagin, looking up with an expression of devilish anticipation, and speaking slowly, and with marked emphasis. He's tired. Tired with watching for her so long. Watching for her, Bill. What do you mean? Asked Sykes, drawing back. The angel made no answer. Mr. Fagin made no answer. But bending over the sleeper again, hauled him into a sitting posture. I was going to say matrimony. What's wrong with me? When his assumed name had been appealed. Damn it. When his assumed name had been repeated several times. Noah rubbed his eyes and, giving a heavy yawn, looked sleepily about him. Tell me that again. Once again, just for him to hear, said Mr. Fagin, pointing to Sykes as he spoke. Tell you what? Asked the sleepy Noah, shaking himself pettishly. That about Nancy, said Mr. Fagin, clutching Sykes by the wrist, as if to prevent his leaving the house before he'd heard enough. You followed her? Yes. She has pretty well settled that in her own mind. To London Bridge. With the Artful Dodger? Asked Sykes. No. It's not that kind of conversation. Yes. Where she met two people. So she did. A gentleman and a lady that she had gone to of her own accord before, who asked her to give up all her pals and monks first, which she did. And to describe him, which she did. And to tell her what house it was that we met at, and go to, which she did. And where it could be best watched from, which she did. And what time the people went there, which she did. She did all this. She told it all, every word, without a threat, without a murmur. She did. Didn't she? CRIED space THE space capital JEW comma space HALF space MAD space WITH space FURY period. All right, replied Noah, scratching his head. That's just what it was. What did they say about last Sunday? Demanded Mr. Fagin. About last Sunday? Replied Noah, considering. What? I told you that before. Again! Tell it again! Cried Fagin, tightening his grasp on Sykes, and brandishing his other hand aloft as the foam flew from his lips. They asked her, said Noah, who, as he grew more wakeful, seemed to have a dawning perception who Sykes was. They asked her why she didn't come last Sunday as she promised. She said she couldn't. Why? Interrupted Mr. Fagin triumphantly. Tell him that. Because she was forcibly kept at home by Bill, the man she had told them of before, replied Noah. What more of him? Cried Mr. Fagin. What more of the man she had told them of before? Tell him that. Oh, that she couldn't very easily get out of doors unless he knew where she was going to, said Noah. And so the first time she went to see the lady, she... It made me laugh when she said it, that did. She gave him a drink of laudanum. Hell's fire, cried Sykes, breaking fiercely from Mr. Fagin. I guess I don't have to call him Mr. anymore. Hell's fire, cried Sykes, breaking fiercely from Fagin. Hell's fire, cried Mr. Sykes, breaking fiercely from Mr. Fagin. Let me go! Flinging the old man from him, he rushed from the room and darted wildly and furiously up the stairs. Bill! Cried Mr. Fagin, following him hastily. A word, only a word. The word would not have been exchanged, but that the housebreaker was unable to open the door, on which he was expending fruitless oaths in violence when Mr. Fagin came panting up. Let me out, said Mr. Sykes. Don't speak to me, it's not safe. Let me out, I say. Hear me speak a word, rejoined Mr. Fagin, laying his hand upon the lock. You won't be... Well, replied the other, you won't be too violent, Bill, whined Mr. Fagin. The day was breaking. There was light enough for the men to see each other's faces. They exchanged one brief glance. There was a fire in the eyes of both which could not be mistaken. "I mean," said Mr. Fagin, showing that he felt all disguise was not... "Sorry, not too violent for safety. Not too violent for safety. Be crafty, Bill, and not too bold. Not too violent for safety. Be crafty, Bill, and not too bold. Not too violent for safety. Be crafty, Bill, and not too bold." Sykes made no reply, but pulling open the door of which Mr. Jesus Christ had turned the lock, dashed into the silent streets. "Your dad can do something about it, Jesus." Without one pause or a moment's consideration, without once turning his head to the right or left, or raising his eyes to the sky, or lowering them to the ground, but looking straight before him with savage resolution, his teeth so tightly compressed that the strange jaw seemed startling through his skin, the robber held on his headlong course, nor muttered a word, nor relaxed a muscle, until he reached his own door. He opened it softly with a key, strode lightly up the stairs, and entering his own room, double-locked the door, and lifting a heavy table against it, drew back the curtain of the bed. The girl was lying half-dressed upon it. He had wakened her from her sleep, for she raised herself with a hurried and startled look. "Get up," said the man. "It is you, Bill," said the girl, with an expression of pleasure at his return. "It is," was the reply. "Get up." There was a candle burning, but the man hastily drew it from the candlestick and hurled it under the grate. Seeing the faint light of early day without, the girl rose to undraw the curtain. "Let it be," said Sykes, thrusting his hand before her. "There's light enough for what I've got to do." "Bill," said the girl in a low voice of alarm, "why do you look like that at me? Why do you look like that at me? Why only look?" The robber sat regarding her for a few seconds with dilated nostrils and heaving breast, and then grasping her by the head and throat, dragged her into the middle of the room, and looking once toward the door, placed his heavy hand upon her mouth. "Bill, Bill," gasped the girl, wrestling with the strength of mortal fear. I won't scream or cry, not once. Hear me? Speak to me. Tell me what I've done." "You know, you she-devil," returned the robber, suppressing his breath. "You were watched tonight. Every word you said was heard." "Then spare my life, for the love of heaven, as I spared yours," rejoined the girl, clinging to him. "Bill, dear Bill, you cannot have the heart to kill me." "Oh, think of all I've given up only this one night for you. You shall have time to think, and save yourself this crime. I will not loose my hold. You cannot throw me off. Bill, Bill, for dear God's sake, for your own, for mine, stop before you spill my blood. I've been true to you. Upon my guilty soul I have." The man struggled violently to release his arms, but those of the girl were clasped round his, and tear her as he would, he could not tear them away. "Bill," cried the girl, striving to lay her head upon his breast, "I miss you. The gentleman and that dear lady told me tonight of a home in some foreign country where I could end my days in solitude and peace. Let me see them again and beg them on my knees to show the same mercy and goodness to you. Let us both leave this dreadful place and far apart lead better lives. Forget how we've lived, except in prayers, and never see each other more. It's never too late to repent. They told me so I feel it now. We must have time, a little time. The housebreaker freed one arm and grasped his pistol. The certainty of immediate detection if he fired flashed across his mind, even in the midst of his fury, and he beat it twice, with all the force he could summon, upon the upturned face that almost touched his own. She staggered and fell. Nearly silenced with the blood that rained down from a deep gash in her forehead, but blinding herself with difficulty on her knees, drew from her bosom a white handkerchief, Rose Malay's own, and raising it up in her folded hands as high towards heaven as her feeble strength would hold her, breathed one prayer for mercy to her allower. It was a ghastly figure to look upon, the murderer staggering backward to the wall and shutting out the sight with his hand. Maker seized a heavy club and struck her down. Book the 2nd, chapter the 12th, containing the unsatisfactory result of Oliver's adventure and a conversation of some importance between Harry, Malay, Mr. Malay, and Rose. Maker seized. When the inmates of the house, attracted by Oliver's cries, hurried to the spot from which they proceeded, they found him, pale and agitated, pointing in the direction of the meadows behind the house, and scarcely able to articulate the words, "Fagin! Fagin!" Mr. Giles was at a loss to comprehend what this outcry meant. But Harry Malay, whose perceptions were something quicker and who had heard Oliver's history from his mother, understood it at once. "What direction did he take?" he asked, catching up a heavy stick which was standing in a corner. "That," replied Oliver, pointing out the course the men had taken. "I missed them all in an instant." "Then they are in the ditch," said Harry. "Follow, and keep as near me as you can." So saying, he sprang over the hedge and darted off with a speed which rendered it matter of exceeding difficulty for the others to keep near him. Giles followed as well as he could, but Oliver followed too, and in the course of a minute or two, Mr. Losberne, who had been out walking and just then returned, tumbled over the hedge after them, and picking himself up with more agility than he could have been supposed to possess, struck into the same course at no contemptible speed, shouting all the while most prodigiously to know what was the matter. On they all went, nor stopped they once to breathe, until the leader, striking off into an angle of the field indicated by Oliver, began to search narrowly the ditch and hedge adjoining, which afforded time for the remainder of the party to come up, and for Oliver to communicate to Mr. Losberne the circumstances that had led to so vigorous a pursuit. The search was all in vain. There were not even the traces of recent footsteps to be seen. They stood now on the summit of a little hill, commanding the open fields in every direction for 3 or 4 miles. There was the village in the hollow on the left, but in order to gain that, after pursuing the track Oliver had pointed out, the men must have made a circuit of open ground which it was impossible they could have accomplished in so short time. A thick wood skirted the meadowland in another direction, but they could not have gained that covert for the same reason. "It must have been a dream, Oliver," said Mr. Malay. Harry, taking him aside, "Oh, no, indeed, sir," replied Oliver, shuddering at the very recollection of the old wretch's countenance. "I saw him too plainly for that. I saw them both as plainly as I see you now." "Who was the other?" inquired Harry and Mr. Losberne together. "The very same man that I told you of, who came upon me so suddenly at the inn," said Oliver. "We had our eyes fixed full upon each other, and I could swear to him." "They took this way?" demanded Harry. "Are you certain of that?" "As I am that the men were at the window," replied Oliver, pointing down as he spoke to the hedge which divided the cottage garden from the meadow. "The tall man leapt over just there, and Fagin, running a few paces to the right, crept through that gap." The two gentlemen watched Oliver's earnest face as he spoke, and looking from him to each other, seemed to feel satisfied of the accuracy of what he said. Still, in no direction were there any appearances of the trampling of men in hurried flight. The grass was long, but it was trodden down nowhere save where their own feet had crushed it. The sides and brinks of the ditches were of damp clay, but in no one place could they discern the print of men's shoes, or the slightest mark which would indicate that any feet had pressed the ground for hours before. "This is strange," said Harry. "Strange?" echoed the doctor. "Blathers and Duff themselves could make nothing of it." Notwithstanding the evidently inefficacious nature of their search, however, they did not desist until the coming of a great song, coming on of night, rendered its further prosecution hopeless. And even then they gave it up with reluctance. Giles was dispatched to the different alehouses in the village, furnished with the best description Oliver could give of the appearance and dress of the strangers, of whom Mr. Fagin was at all events sufficiently remarkable to be remembered, supposing he had been seen drinking or loitering about, but he returned without any intelligence calculated to dispel or lessen the mystery. On the next day further search was made, and the inquiries renewed, but with no better success. On the day following, Oliver and Mr. Maylay repaired to the market town, in the hope of seeing or hearing something of the men there, but this effort was equally fruitless, and after a few days the affair began to be forgotten, as most affairs are, when wonder, having no fresh food to support it, dies away of itself. Meanwhile, Rose was rapidly recovering. She had left her room and was able to go out, and mixing once more with the family, carried joy in the hearts of all. With the hearts of all. They're playing cards. But although this happy change had a visible effect on the little circle, and although cheerful voices, merry laughter were once more heard in the cottage, there was at times an unwonted restraint upon some there, even upon Rose herself, which Oliver could not fail to remark. Mrs. Maylay and her son were often closeted together for a long time, and more than once Rose appeared with traces of tears upon her face. After Mr. Losberne had fixed a day for his departure to Chertsey, these symptoms increased, and it became evident that something was in progress which affected the peace of the young lady, and of somebody else besides. At length, one morning, when Rose was alone in the breakfast parlour, Harry Maylay entered, and with some hesitation begged permission to speak with her for a few moments. A very few will suffice, Rose. Let me get my sea legs. A very few, said the young man, drawing his chair towards her. What I shall have to say has already presented itself to your mind. The most cherished hopes of my heart are not unknown to you, though my lips you have not yet heard them stated. Rose had been very pale for the... I am not funny enough to know the sexual innuendo they're doing. I can just read it, so I'm not going to be able to read it. Rose had been very pale from the moment of his entrance, although that might have been the effect of her recent illness. She merely bowed, and bending over some plants that stood near, waited in silence for him to proceed. I ought to have left here before, said Harry. You should indeed, replied Rose. Forgive me for saying so, but I wish you had. I was brought here by the most dreadful and agonizing of all apprehensions, said the young man. The fear of losing the one dear being on whom my every wish and hope are centered. You've been dying, trembling between earth and heaven. We know that when the young, the beautiful, and good are visited with sickness, their pure spirits insensibly turn towards their bright home of lasting rest, and hence it is that the best and fairest of our kind so often fade in blooming. There were tears in the eyes of the gentle girl as these words were spoken, and when one fell upon the flower over which she bent, and glistened brightly in its cup, making it more beautiful. It seemed as though the outpourings of a fresh young heart claimed common kindred with the loveliest things in nature. An angel, continued the young man passionately, a creature as fair and innocent of guile as one of God's own angels, fluttered between life and death. Oh, who could hope, when the distant world to which she was akin half opened to her view, that she would return to the sorrow and calamity of this? Rose, Rose, to know that you were passing away like some soft shadow with which a light from above casts upon the earth, to have no hope that you would be spared to those who linger here, and to know no reason why you should, to feel that you belong to that bright sphere where so many gifted creatures in infancy and youth have winged their early flight, and yet to pray amid all those consolations, these consolations, that you might be restored to those who loved you. These are distractions almost too great to bear. They were mine by day and night, and with them came such a rushing torrent of fears and apprehensions and selfish regrets lest you should die and never know how devotedly I loved you, as almost bore down sense and reason in its course. You recovered. Day by day and almost hour by hour, some drop of health came back, and mingling with the spent and feeble stream of life which circulated languidly within you, swelled it again to a high and rushing tide. I have watched you change almost from life death to life, with eyes that moistened with their own eagerness and deep affection. Do not tell me that you wish I had lost this, for it has softened my heart to all mankind. I did not mean that, said Rose, weeping. I only wished you had left here, that you might have turned to high and noble pursuits again, to pursuits well worthy of you. There's no pursuit more worthy of me, more worthy of the highest nature that exists, than the struggle to win such a heart as yours, said the old man, taking her hand. Rose, my own dear Rose, for years I've loved you, hoping to win my way to fame, and then come proudly home and tell you it'd been sought, only for you to share, thinking in my day dreams how I would remind you in that happy moment of the many silent tokens I'd given of a boy's blindness, attachment, and rally you who had blushed to mark them, and then claim your hand as if in redemption of some old mute contract that had been sealed between us. That time has not arrived, but here, with no fame won and no young vision realized, I give to you the heart so long your own, and stake my all upon the words with which you greet the offer. Your behavior has ever been kind and noble, said Rose, mastering the emotions which by which she was agitated. As you believe that I'm not insensible or ungrateful, so hear my answer. It is that I may endeavor to deserve you? Is it, dear Rose? It is, replied Rose, that you must endeavor to forget me, not as your old and dearly attached companion, for that would wound me deeply, but as the object of your love. Look into the world, think how many hearts you would be equally proud to gain are there. Confide some other passion to me if you will, and I will be the truest, warmest, most faithful friend you have. There was a pause during which Rose, who had covered her face with one hand, gave free vent to her tears. Harry still retained the other. "And your reasons, Rose," he said at length in a low voice, "your reasons for this decision, may I ask them?" "You have a right to know them," rejoined Rose. "You can say nothing to alter my resolution. It's a duty that I must perform. I owe it alike to others and to myself." "To yourself?" "Yes, Harry, I owe it to myself that I, a friendless, portionless girl with a blight upon my name, should not give the world reason to suspect that I had sordidly yielded to your first passion, and fashioned myself a clog upon all your hopes and projects. I owe it to you and yours to prevent you from opposing, in the warmth of your generous nature, this great obstacle to your progress in the world." "If your inclinations chime with your sense of duty," Harry began. "They do not," replied Rose, coloring deeply. "Then you return my love," said Harry. Say but that, Rose, say but that, and soften the bitterness of this hard disappointment. If I could have done so without doing heavy wrong to him I loved, rejoined Rose, I could have received this declaration very differently, said Harry with great eagerness. Do not conceal that from me at least, Rose. I could, said Rose. Stay, she added, disengaging her hand. Why should we prolong this painful interview? Most painful to me, and yet productive of lasting happiness notwithstanding. For it will be happiness to know that I once held the high place in your regard which I now occupy, and every triumph you achieve in life will animate me with new fortitude and firmness. Farewell, Harry, for as we've met today, we meet no more, but in other relations than those in which this conversation would have placed us. May we be long and happily entwined, and may every blessing that the prayers of a true and earnest heart can call down from where all is truth and sincerity cheer and prosper you. Another word, Rose, said Harry. Your reason in your own words, from your own lips, let me hear it. The prospect before you, answered Rose firmly, is a brilliant one. All the honors to which great talents and powerful connections can help men in life, public life. Powerful connections can help men in public life are in store for you. But those connections are proud, and I will neither mingle with such as hold in scorn the mother who gave me life, nor bring disgrace or failure upon the son of her who has so well supplied that mother's place. In a word, said the young lady, turning away as her temporary firmness forsook her, there's a stain upon my name which the world visits on innocent heads. I will carry it into no blood but my own, and the reproach shall rest alone on me. One word more, Rose, dear, one more, cried Harry, throwing himself before her. If I had been less fortunate, as the world would call it, if some obscure and peaceful life had been my destiny, if I had been poor, sick, helpless, would you have turned from me then? Or has my probable advancement to riches and honor given this scruple birth? Do not press me to reply, answered Rose. The question does not arise, and never will. It's unfair, unkind to urge it. If your answer be what I almost dare to hope it is, retorted Harry, it will shed a gleam of happiness upon my lonely way, and light the dreary path before me. It's not an idle thing to do so much by the utterance of a few brief words. For one who loves us beyond all else. Oh, Rose, in the name of my ardent and enduring attachment, entwine. Read. In the name of all I've suffered for you, and all you do me to undergo, answer me that one question. Then if your lot had been differently cast, rejoined Rose. If you'd been even a little, but not so far above me, if I could have been a help and comfort to you in some humble scene of peace and retirement, not a blot and drawback in ambitious and distinguished crowds, I should have been spared this trial. I have every reason to be happy, very happy now, but then, Harry, I own I should have been happier. Busy recollections of old hopes cherished as the girl long ago crowded into the mind of Rose while making this avowal. But they brought tears with them, as old hopes will when they come back withered, and they relieved her. I cannot help this weakness, and it makes my purpose stronger, said Rose, extending her hand. I must leave you now, indeed. I ask one promise, said Harry, once and only once more. Say within a year, but it may be much sooner. Let me speak to you again on this subject for the last time. Not to press me to alter my right determination, replied Rose with a melancholy smile. It will be useless. No, said Harry. To hear you repeat it, if you will, finally repeat it. I will lay at your feet whatever of station or fortune I may possess. And if you still adhere to your present resolution, Will you not seek by word or act to change it? Then let it be so, rejoined Rose. It is but one pang the more, and by that time I may be enabled to bear it better. She extended her hand again, but the young man caught her to his bosom, and imprinting one kiss upon her beautiful forehead, hurried from the room.